Morning, church. Who's excited to be here? Excellent. I noticed there was a few people late this morning, and it must have been hard for you to get out of bed on this nice winter's morning. Who found it hard to get out of bed this morning? Quite a few people. But you're here now, and that's good. I hope there's no one still left in bed. But it is a blessing to be here worshipping God together. Today we're going to look at Revelation chapter 14. And Revelation chapter 14, I've termed it the glorious conclusion. The glorious conclusion. This is actually our conclusion to the book of Revelation. Does it conclude in Revelation 14? No. But remember that we've been looking at Revelation in a different way. We've been looking at it through this chiastic structure where we've been building from each end towards the middle. And the last couple of months we've been focusing on this middle section between when the gospel was commissioned to go to the world through the people that had their bittersweet experience. They were told to prophesy again. And we saw the efforts in chapter 11, but we saw also what we were to share the three angels' messages. And I love Isaac's presentation there on that. Although I wasn't there, I was up in Darwin, and I didn't get to hear it on the day because where I was, there wasn't much reception. But I certainly listened to it afterwards, and it was very good, and there was a lot of good stuff there. And if you missed that, go back and catch it on YouTube. And you can process that as well. But today we're going to be looking at either side of those three angels' messages. We're going to see that that Revelation 14 is actually in three parts. So we got verses 1 to 5, then we've got the three angels' messages, and then we've got this last section in the very end. What we're going to find is in that first section, we've got a picture of God's people standing on Zion with God. And it's interesting because then we go back to the sharing of this final message of the three angels' messages. And then we go to this glorious conclusion. I'm going to call it a glorious conclusion, but it doesn't look so glorious at parts. But I'm going to share with you it is a glorious conclusion because it's going to be the end of evil. We're going to look at three questions today. And in those three questions, we're going to look at if God is love, why is there evil? We sort of little touched on that in our lesson out in the hall there today. But if God is love, one of the biggest questions I have come to me when people are wanting to have Bible studies is, if God is a God of love, why does he allow evil? And Isaac, would this be one of the hardest questions to answer? It is a difficult question to answer, but my simple and first response to this question is, if he wasn't a God of love, then there couldn't be evil. So because he is a God of love, that's the reason we have evil. Now that doesn't make sense to a lot of us. Who reckons that makes sense? A couple of people. Yeah. And I noticed that a couple of those people have put up their hands. They're a bit of biblical scholars. But what I'm going to propose to you today is that it's the reason that God is a God of love, that's the reason we have evil. Because when God creates, he creates with a free will. He creates, and in that there is a huge risk. But he can't create robots, because if he was create robots that were all perfect, then there wouldn't be love. One of my favourite tools on my phone is Siri. And she does everything basically nearly everything I ask. But when I ask her, do you love me? She goes, that's an interesting concept, or she just goes around the outside of it. She can't actually tell me. And I'm glad she hasn't been programmed to tell me that, because that would not make sense if she did, because she is programmed to do everything that she does. But God cannot create beings without creating them with a free choice to either choose to follow or not to follow. But we're going to see that the third question will be, will there be an end to evil? And sometimes we look at this, will there be an end to evil, and it can't come quick enough. You know, if I put up a poll here and had a nice red button on it, and I said to you, you could stop evil if you come and press this button, do you think I would be inundated with people coming to press that button? I think I would too. But God is smarter than us because he created us. And if he is more intelligent than us and he is the only one that's able to press that button, why hasn't he pressed it just yet? So we're going to look at that as well. Will there be an end to evil? There certainly will. But the more pressing question that we need to ask is, what can I do to have the assurance that I will take part in what we see in the last part of Revelation 14? In the last part of Revelation 14, we see this great harvest. We see two harvests. The first one, where it's described as a wheat harvest, and the second harvest is where it's described as a grape harvest. And that's not a real pretty picture. But what it's going to reveal is that it is the end of evil. And I believe when we look at our world today, that day is fast approaching. That day is fast approaching. Revelation 14 makes it clear that in the end there are only two groups of people. How many? Two groups of people in the very end. One who is with God and the other who is without God. Revelation 14 also makes it clear that God's just judgments are executed due to the rejection of his mercy and grace. And Revelation 14 also makes it clear that God will finally bring an end to all evil. But the way he does it, he will do it in such a way that will preserve free will. He will do it with a way that will do an end to evil and will preserve free will. So let's take a look at this first part of Revelation 14 because it's a very interesting picture in Revelation 14. And what we're going to discover about this group of people here is that they are actually contrasted to the people who have the mark of the beast in their foreheads or in their hands, as in Revelation 13. When we look at this structure of Revelation 14, how we get there, we see in Revelation 12 we have the great controversy between good and evil. We see the devil's attacks on Christ. We see that the devil's attacks were on Christ from the very beginning, and then we finally see that when the devil was cast out of being able to attack Christ in heaven, he focused his attacks on us. And in Revelation 13, we saw those attacks being played out through the devil's agents, through the sea beast and the land beast. But when we get to Revelation chapter 14, we actually see God's people described in a very interesting way. So I want you to open your Bibles with me to Revelation 14, and we're going to have a look at these first 5 verses. Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb standing on Zion, and with him 144,000 having the Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of a loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn the song except for the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they were virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God. Wow. How many people reckon they measure up to that list? Put your hand up, nice and high so we can all see. Lucy, excellent, excellent. We're to be like little children, aren't we? Yeah. Here we see this description of God's people. This description as in 144,000, and we're not going to go through the 144,000 again because we cover that in chapter 7, and you can certainly go back and look at that on the YouTube channel, the 144,000. But we see here that this group of people, and it's actually basically God's number of his people. We know that the tribes of Israel were 12, made up of 12 tribes. The apostles, 12 by 12, 144, and we see this picture. But it's God's people standing with him on Mount Zion. And we find that they sang a new song. A new song. We only have to go over to chapter 15 and verse 2, and we find that this new song is the same song as the song that the Israelites sang with Moses. And we see and we have a look at that situation, and we find that the people there at this point of time when they sang this new song, they were on the other side of the sea, the Red Sea that had been opened up for them. Before that time that they were encompassed about, they had mountains on this side, they had the sea on this side, and they had the Egyptian army approaching from this side, and to them there was no way out. But what did God do? God provided a way and opened up the sea for them to go through, but it was also the way that he destroyed their enemies. And they were standing on the other side, being redeemed through what God had done for them. So we find that they sang a new song, and we find that they were redeemed from the earth. I love this word redeemed because it's metaphorically expressing the release of someone from slavery. This idea of being redeemed means that we have a price been paid to actually free us from that slavery. And so this group of people, they are redeemed. They've been freed because of what Jesus has done for them. And they are virgins. Now, we're not talking about in a sexual sense here, but here we're talking about in the fact that this is opposite to the beast. We notice that the beast causes the kings of the earth to fornicate with her, and they cause all the nations to fornicate with her as well. So basically, they're getting them to go against God's ways. But this people is spoken of in opposite to the people with the seal, the mark in their foreheads and in their hands that follow the beast wherever he goes. And it's interesting because when you look at Revelation 13 verse 8, it gives us a description of only two groups that remain on the earth. Those who worship the beast and those who have their names written in the Lamb's book of life. And we're going to see that picture right at the end of Revelation 14 of just two groups. But this word for virgins mean that they're opposite to the beast. They're not following other ways as well. They're not following man's ways. They're just stuck on following God's ways and staying true to him. And that's also spoken in the next section where it says that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. I want to talk about this more at the end of this. Following the Lamb, what does that mean? What does that look like? And just briefly, it means that, hey, we are set on following Jesus no matter what. They're described as first fruits, and many misunderstand this term of first fruits, but certainly the term here, first fruits, reminds us that in Jeremiah that the children of Israel were classed as God's first fruits. We know the children of Israel, when they went into their promised land, they took over the Canaanites' land, and the fruit and everything, and the trees and the fields were already ready for them just to harvest and have food. And what they were to do is they were to bring that back to God. God had supplied them with this land, with this food, and they were to bring the very first parts of the harvest back to God. And they were to bring it into the temple. What happened to the rest? The rest were consumed by humans. But this part was for God, the first fruits. So in respect of what we're talking about here, we're going to see right at the end of Revelation chapter 14, we're going to see the two harvests. And the first harvest is going to be spoken of in the form of first fruits. That's the first harvest that takes place. That's the first fruits. And then we have the second harvest. So this idea of first fruits doesn't mean that they're more pure than anyone else. It means that they've been separated and they're put aside and brought into the temple of God, and the others are left outside the temple of God, which we're also going to see. There is no deceit in their mouth. This is opposite again to the deception of the devil and his agents in Revelation 13. There is no deceit, there is no guile, and I love the next part. They are without fault. I think maybe this is the reason why you couldn't put up your hand, because maybe you couldn't say you were without fault. But you know, when I look at Hebrews chapter 11, I see all these great men of faith who believed in the promise, and because of that, they are seen without fault. Did they have fault? You only have to go back to the Old Testament and you see many faults in them. But they are without fault because they are redeemed and they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Last week we talked about Peter. And Peter was one, and the thing that I really admire about Peter was that he didn't want to be separated from Christ. He wanted to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And when he didn't want Jesus to wash his feet, he said to Jesus, "You're not going to wash my feet." And Jesus said, "If I do not wash you, you cannot be a part of me." And he immediately changes and said, "Well, just do whatever you have to do. Wash all of me." Why? Because he was wanting to follow the Lamb. And Jesus said they were all clean. In other words, they were without fault because of their connection to Jesus, because they had determined in their minds that they were going to follow the Lamb wherever he went. And that's why they had the Father's name in their foreheads, the seal of the living God. Again, opposite to the beast. So we see this contrast of God's people in contrast to those who worship the beast and follow his image. We're going to skip the middle section because Isaac so well covered that a couple of weeks ago. And we're going to go to the third section, which is found in verse 14. And the reason why we're doing this, I mean, it's amazing. We're going to reveal how that impacts the two groups of people, but they are separated. I love how it starts with God's people in heaven, but then it goes back to what they were actually to do before they got there. You know, Daniel does that a lot, and also Revelation does that. And certainly when you look at Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7, it gives a picture of Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven, and every eye will see him. That wasn't the conclusion of it, but it's for us to keep in mind. And one of the things that we talked about in our lesson today was it's good to keep in mind how it's going to end. And we've got to be the hands and feet in Jesus until that time. So let's have a look at Revelation chapter 14 and verse 14. And I want to read from verse 14 to 16. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his hand a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And the other angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Here we have a description of the Son of Man. Already in the beginning of Revelation, we've talked about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. We see that this is a picture of Jesus. He has a golden crown. The reason why he has this golden crown, and the crown here is a victory crown. He has defeated the forces of evil. And here we find the time has come. The time has come to reap the harvest, because the harvest is what? It's ripe. It's ready. It's time. You know, we see this picture of a time when everyone has made up their minds, either for God or against God. And here, this time is right. And so it's time to harvest. And like I said, this first harvest that takes place is described as the first fruits harvest. It's like the grain harvest where it was brought in before God. And that's why we saw in the first 5 verses of Revelation 14 this group of people standing before God. This is this people that are harvested at this time. This is the glorious end. But sadly, there is another harvest. And I need to warn you about this other harvest, and the language we're going to see in this other harvest is quite scary, really, if you think about it. What it's doing is it's telling us the seriousness of this harvest. Verse 17 says, "Then another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle, and another angel came out from the altar having power over fire. And he cried with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Thrust in your sickle, your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the wine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe.' So the angel thrust in his sickle to the earth, and he gathered the vine of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horse's bridle for 1,600 furlongs." I don't know if you're a picture person, but this is not a pretty picture. This is not a pretty picture. Here we see this angel coming from the temple, and it reminds us of Revelation 6 and verse 10, where people cried out saying, "How long, O Lord? How long do you allow these wicked people to do their wickedness? How long before you're going to bring judgment? How long are you going to leave it?" You know, when I think of the story of Jonah, one of the reasons Jonah didn't want to go to the city Nineveh and preach against it, because he knew that God was a gracious God. He was just like this. Jonah would have actually been the first one up to press this red button, I believe. He would have been up there and go, "Yeah, let's just get rid of them people." But what did God show Jonah right in the last chapter of Jonah? They're my people too, and I care about them as well. So if they're going to repent and turn to me, I'm not going to destroy them. I want to save them. The reason why we still have evil is because God's still looking to save people. But there is going to come a time when we see this picture here. And notice that it's talked about not now as a wheat harvest, but as a great harvest. And they're put into the winepress of the wrath of God. God now is bringing about his justice judgments. And when he presses down the grapes, what comes out? Blood. Whoever's got blood out of a grape? We've got grape juice out of a grape, but not blood. And back in Revelation 6 and verse 10, it tells us, "Those who have shed the blood of many." They were the ones shedding the blood. Now their blood is spilt out. And it comes out how far? 1,600 furlongs. 1,600 is a number of 4 by 4, and 4 is the completeness of God's work. And so really it's just telling us the completeness of the destruction that's going to happen at this time. Later on we're going to see that the 7 last plagues come from this picture, which we're going to talk about this week, Yeah. So here we see this gathering of the grapes because they are fully ripe. Fully ripe. That word is significant because, you know, God never destroys while ever there's a chance to save. We saw right in the very beginning of time at the flood, we see that he only destroyed because they were evil continually. And what did he do? He still held off for another 120 years I'm telling our Bible workers as they go out and knock on doors, don't get discouraged. Think of Noah, who preached for 120 years and only saved his family. But that was God giving them one last chance. We see in Sodom and Gomorrah that there weren't even 5 people that God could save. So he had to destroy that city because it became evil continually. We saw Jonah wasn't happy with God saving Nineveh, but we find that eventually Nineveh's destruction came about in the book of Nahum. We find God's first point of call is to try and save, but he also wants to eradicate evil. And notice that these ones are the ones that are outside the city. We find the others that are on Mount Zion are with God in the city, but these ones are outside the city. To look at these 3 questions we talked about, I want us to go back to Matthew 13. Because in Matthew 13, we're going to see the answer to these questions that we proposed. Matthew 13 is where Jesus told a parable. He actually told 7 parables in the book of Matthew. The kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like. And this is one of the ones that he said the kingdom of heaven is like. And I want us to see the parallels between this harvest at the end of time. So Matthew chapter 13, and in verse 37 it says, "And he answered and said to them, he who sows the good seed," he's out now actually explaining that parable about how that there was a sower come along and planted good seed in the field, but while they were asleep, an enemy came in and sowed tares. So here he says that the one who sows it is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Here we're getting a picture of why evil. God didn't design evil. He planted good seed. But we notice in verse 29, actually let's read verse 28 and 29. He said to them, "An enemy has done this." The servant said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" What they were actually asking was that they come along and press that stop evil button. Let's get rid of evil right now. Let's just tear them up. And what does Jesus say? "No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them." God here is giving us a picture of why evil. He didn't do it, but an enemy has done this. An enemy that was created with a free choice, and in the beginning he was created perfect. But he is the reason for the evil that we are faced with on this earth. And our solution, just like the servant's solution there, was, well, let's just get rid of it now. I'm done with this evil. I hate seeing bad things happen. How many people want to get rid of evil right now? Think about those people that haven't made a decision yet. Some of them are our family members. And for those, I want God to take a little bit more time. Lest while you gather them up, you uproot the wheat with them. Then in 41 and 42, the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and he will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth. If you've been looking at this slide that I've got up now, you can see the parallels between this section. That the good seed is the Son of Man. In Revelation 14, we see the good seed of those that are with the Lamb in heaven. The tares are the sons of the wicked one. We see in chapter 13 the activities of the tares and what they are doing. Verse 29, he says, don't pull them out. And chapter 6, what Isaac shared was this not happening until he had given a final warning message. The 3 angels' messages that were to be shared to the rest of the world. The righteous shine forth like the sun, and the wicked are fully ripe. When the Lord is going to do this, he's going to bring about a total end. As in Revelation chapter 22, it says, let the righteous be righteous still, let the wicked be wicked still. There is going to come a point when the probation closes, and at that point, whatever your decision has made that's what will be. So if God is a God of love, why does evil exist? Simply because he is a God of love. He lets each one of us make our own decision, either for him or against him. And this picture in Revelation chapter 14, the harvest doesn't come until the judgment period and the 3 angels' messages go forth. Will there be an end to evil? We've just read it, that there will be an end. And it will be a glorious end. Because those people who have made the decision not to be with God, that will be respected. And those people who have made a decision to be with God, that will also be respected. And they will be harvested. What can I do to have a part? What can I do to have the assurance of being a part of that first harvest? How many people want to be part of the first harvest? Put up your hands. I would hope every hand would go up then. Well, this is what you need to do. You need to have the Father's name written in your foreheads. You know, I love studying with people that have already determined in their mind that they're going to follow God no matter what, and they find a new truth and they go, well, if that's God's way, I'm going to follow it. We're going to have a baptism in a couple of weeks. And one of the guys that we've been studying with, he says, you know what, if that's God's will, I want to follow it. And he's had to make some hard decisions, but he's got the Father's name written in his foreheads. We need to accept the redemption that is offered through Jesus Christ. You know, I love the way that God redeemed us because it shows us his true character. It shows us the love that he has for each one of us, and it shows us how he governs by first giving of himself. Man, that's attractive, isn't it? That's attractive. You know, when we don't spend time looking at what Jesus did for us, we won't see it as attractive because we'll let everything else cloud. But when we do spend time, we will see that that is attractive. We need to be virgins. We need to be virgins in the sense that we stay true to the teachings of God's word. And we need to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. What does that look like? Remember I asked that question? Following the Lamb wherever he goes. Neville and I were talking about this in the car on the way home on Wednesday night, weren't we, Neville? One of the things that we need to do is just to have so resolute in our minds that we just want to be with Jesus. We want to be with the Lamb. We need to spend time with him. We need to talk to him. But we also need to hear from him. How do we hear from him? We actually read his word. That's his love letter to us. And you know, when I find in my journey, as soon as I start to come off that mountaintop, I know exactly what's happening. And I know when I visit people from this church and I say, how's your spiritual journey going? And if they say not so good, I say, do you know what it is? And they said, yep, I haven't been spending time with the Lamb. I haven't been following him wherever he goes. This picture of God's people are those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And no matter what we face in this life, we will be able to handle it. The Lamb is attractive. You can't see that picture, but it's a picture that we started with of the three crosses looking through the tunnel. And I want to tell you why I chose this picture. Because this picture reveals that Jesus is attractive. And it's looking out of a tunnel. Sometimes we're in a tunnel in our lives, but if we look through that window and we can see out as the sun rises at those crosses on the hill, we see that that's what Jesus did to redeem each one of us. That's how much he cares for each one of us. That's how much he wants each one of us to be with him. As I've looked through Revelation 14 this week, I've seen that we do have evil because God is a God of love. But in that middle section, we have that God is now giving everyone one last chance. Because he is going to press the button. And my prayer for each one of us here today is that we will all be there when that happens, and that we will be the first fruits to God and to the Lamb. I want to invite you to stand as we close in prayer. And if you want to be part of that group, I want you to raise your hand. And I want to pray for you today, that you will be ready for that time when he comes again. Dear Father in heaven, I just want to thank you for the decisions that have been made here today. And Lord, in this life where we are in turmoil, when things are going wrong, and there's so many things against us, it is good to know that you are here and that you have a better life for each one of us. May we each be ready, Lord, as you prepare to press that stop evil button. And may we all be part of that first resurrection, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.